Is reductive amination to yield methamphetamine, 4 pounds.
So no pseudo.
No pseudo.
So you do have a plan. Yeah, Mr. White. Yes, science.
Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is A-Buck Nasty. In today's episode of Forever Procrastinating on the Purple Science Competition, we're going to be exploring space science. So, the question that I've had for a while is, which space science quality takes the least update time? So the question is pretty complex, since each quality requires more asteroid upcycling, but reduces the number of buildings and inserters for producing that science. So at the extreme, Q1, or normal quality, requires no upcycling, but the most science assemblers. You can see that as the spaceship that is currently in the middle of the screen. However, Q5, which is legendary, requires the most upcycling, but the least number of production buildings. You can see that on the top right-hand corner of the screen right now, that specific ship design. So, as well, there is a Q4 variant, a Q2, and also a Q3 design. Now, the Q3 design that you're seeing right now is twice the scale of the other ships, and more on that in the rest of the video to come. But that's another thing that I'm curious about exploring is, does the ship size matter? So in other words, if you're building a megabase, should you go and design multiple ships that match, let's say, 4 belts of throughput, respective to that quality, or 8 belts of throughput? So for example, right now, my base, I wind up running 8 fully stacked belts of turbo belts of science, right? So for legendary, I'm going to wind up needing 640 science per second. Whereas if I was running this with Q1, I'd need 3840 science per second. So kind of a scale of things. So the question that I have as well is, okay, should I go and design a spaceship that goes and produces 640 science per second, or 2 smaller ships that produce 320 science per second? That's another question that I have. Finally, I'm curious about how much does this all impact the hub throughput, and does that actually make Q5 better, even though it requires more asteroid upcycling, or is there some middle ground? So going into this, the current meta that exists in megabasing is doing legendary science, and I want to validate if that actually is the best science that's there. So to do that, I've gone about creating at least the 5 ships that you see here, along with 20 other variants that exist in the benchmarks. And also I've had a couple people help specifically in my community to refine specifically the legendary ship itself. So more to come on that video. So those are the questions that we're going to be asking today, and we're going to have an answer by the end of this video. So stay tuned, and I'm excited to talk through it. Initially, let's talk through what all goes into quality space science, right? So if you've been playing Factorio for quite a while, especially if you're playing Space Age, you're going to know about the quality upcycling mechanic that exists for asteroids. But if you don't know, this is a ship that I currently have in my megabase. I have it currently in the editor, and so that we can just go and mess around with it. That's why it's currently dumping all the space science off of the side of the ship so that it just constantly is running. So let's talk through this. So the way that this works, and this is how I had designed the ships in the past, you'd have a module that would handle all the quality 1 science. You wind up, or the quality 1 asteroids. You collect them in these asteroid collectors. They're going to go and bring those items in. They put them on this outside sushi belt. And then this is going to be your normal quality that's up here. You upcycle them using the reprocessing recipe, which is going to give you, every time you wind up doing this, a chance of an 80% chance to get an item back, which is really good. That is so much better than using recyclers, which only has a 25% chance of giving an item back. So, in short, although these recipes are pretty slow with a 2-second crafting time, your odds are so high, and also is that the odds are so high, so that's a really good thing to get a higher quality. The second thing that's really good about this is that you have an infinite research that you can do, which is going to be for asteroid productivity, right? So if you get this up to level 31 with 31 available, that means that you're going to have a 300% productivity bonus, which is the maximum that you can wind up getting. So that means that one of these small metallic asteroid chunks, when it becomes legendary, is actually going to be worth, in this case here, 20 iron ore. But it's not 20 iron ore, it has a 300% productivity, so it actually becomes 80. And then 80 stacks, of course, on top of that when you have 150% product or 50% productivity, so that would be 80 times 1.5. So you're going to get 120 plates per iron plates per individual asteroid that you wind up putting in, which is really, really good. So that means that the actual raw materials that we need to upcycle is very small. Now, sushi is one way of doing this. The problem with that is you'll see some of these inserters will kind of get stuck. There isn't really a consistent pattern to when they're going to be picking up items, especially when you get a huge amount that of volume that comes in. And that's an important thing to talk about too. Along the journey, and we've specifically chosen novice to Fulgora because some people have done some wonderful research and determined that this is going to be the best for getting the ice, which we're going to be the lowest on. So this is going to be the best. Konage specifically was the person who wound up doing that research, and I've been using that as a metric here. So what I'm talking about is you're going to have different points of the journey where you're going to have more asteroid chunks or less asteroid chunks. Now, don't be really confused by this chart. You might look at this initially and say, oh, there's a whole bunch of metallic asteroid chunks. Well, these are the small ones. The large ones and the medium ones show up as you get closer to Fulgora. So the higher volume is actually over here, not over here, although it looks like that. It's a little bit deceiving. But that means that you're going to have a variability to how many chunks you're going to have at any individual time along the journey of the ship. So that's where sushi kind of makes sense because you don't really know how much flow rate you're going to have. You don't want to really exactly design it. But it also makes it really hard to understand conceptually how many items are actually going to be on the belt and how much throughput your demands you're going to have at different points along the journey, especially if you're constantly running. So that's where this particular design style is something that I wanted to get away from as I designed the new ships. We'll get into that in a second. But just to continue to cover this, there's generalized reprocessing. So the way that I would handle this is you'd have Q1 up here on the top. All Q2 and above would come down here, bring into this inner belt, and this is where we had dedicated reprocessors for all of the higher quality here, right? So this is a pretty massive ship for space science specifically. This would go and create 640 science per second. So that's per second, not per minute. And that'd be 640 science legendary. So that's 6 times that. So that's 3,840 legend or total science effectively that this is producing all the time. And we can wind up seeing this here with the global statistics right there. That's 38,400. That is the number. Now, if we zoom in, you'll actually wind up seeing that. So that's the amount that it's going and producing. So the target that I said was for this entire experiment is going to be, hey, I want to take this same target metric here, but I want to go and design multiple ships. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to design some smaller ships just due to the complexity of the task at hand, because we're going to have to design 5 different ships at a minimum for each quality so that we can do this experiment. So we're going to take just this design philosophy here. We're making 320 science per second. That is the goal. So each one has to make at least that amount. 320 science, and I'm talking about that in terms of legendary, and that would be times 6 is 1,920 science per second for each quality. So let me talk through next here what were the design choices to kind of make it as equal of an apples to apples comparison for each of the quality that we wound up testing. So the first thing that I wanted to go and tackle was I wanted something that I could design that's modular, that can support all the different scales of quality science that you're going to need. You're going to need different amounts of reprocessing as you step up the quality. So you're going to need more Q1 input to increase the amount of Q2, Q3, Q4, and then ultimately Q5 that you wind up getting. So that means that the amount of raw inputs you're going to need at each of those quality levels is going to depend on the science you're trying to create. So it means we're going to need more Q1 or more raw asteroid inputs to get legendary, and we're going to need nothing for normal quality science for reprocessing, right? So that's the scale of things. So this design works out really good for that specific use case, because it, 1, eliminates sushi, which was one of the goals that I had. Sure, I'm still using it here for an output belt, but they get sorted down the line anyway. So each of these are kind of modules at different quality levels. So the goal that I had was like, okay, I will go and take an existing design, I will run it back and forth between the planets, and I will continue to remove chunks like this until I get to the point where this backs up and I can't handle the pressure that's coming through it. So at some point in the journey. And so that would give me an indicator of how many items I needed. This is an empirical approach. I could have done this more of just going and doing math to go and figure out how much I needed, but this was very simple to go and design something that's modular like this so that I can step up or step down the amount of items I needed. You're going to notice something too, that this belt is always containing a buffer. The reason I did this was before I actually wound up testing it, I wound up deciding that, hey, one of the design philosophies that I have is, like we talked about, along the journey of the ship, as it goes in between these two different planets, right, we're going to have variable amounts of asteroids we're going to have. So what I don't want to happen is, or what I want to have happen is a very consistent production of those individual chunks, but have the flexibility of quickly jumping up in scale when we need it. So the idea here was that I want these inserters to pick up from a non-moving belt. That was the idea behind this. The second thing that I wanted to do was eliminate the wakeless inputs here. So a really easy way to kind of do both of those things at once, even though you'll see here that sometimes occasionally this won't be processing anything. It'll happen very infrequently if we go and speed this up occasionally. Just watch this little indicator up here. You see here how it runs out of ingredients. So this is exactly designed for the particular clock that I have, and then just slightly over-designed. So if I removed one of these, this would eventually back up. But I can do that visually much easier in a setup like this than if I was going and looking at the old Forester design where I have no idea. I have no idea what my throughput demands are here, and until it's too late and the whole thing clogs up, and that takes a lot longer. So this is very simple to go and actually test because you can visually monitor it by looking at these input belts right here. If these ever back up, which happens very quickly, then you'll wind up knowing that you have two little crushers. So now, you're going to notice here that we have these inserters that are kind of clocked. All this is doing, this is reading each of these individual belts, and it's holding the belt so that it reads just the contents of that one belt. And each one can hold 4 of the asteroids per tile. So all I'm doing here is whenever this gets to be greater than or equal to 12, that means that I have full back pressure, and I will turn on all these inserters. That means that along the entirety of the journey of the ship, these will always pick up from a non-moving belt, even though we have kind of an RNG effect of how many asteroids we're going to get along the actual journey of the ship. Editor Abuck here. So I explained a decent amount about how it actually works, but I didn't explain the most important part, is if it's better for UPS. So here's a chart that kind of explains that. So in version 4.1, we didn't use that control method. We just let the inserters swing freely. And then version 4.2, we wound up using that control method. So the game was paused exactly and this was swapped in place. So you can see that when they were just free-formed, it was 2 microseconds of update time increase for the entity update time. But when it wound up introducing it, the control behavior update time went up the same amount. So it went up 2 microseconds from 19 microseconds to 21. So they exactly balance each other out for having a total of 200 microseconds of total update time. However, this seems like a fair trade-off because we want to reduce overall the entity update time more than the control behavior update time in most scenarios. Those then all get fed in, and then we have a smaller amount for the ice because, of course, the ice processing is 1 second compared to the other ones, which are 2-second recipes. So they wind up, this one's being faster, so you have a lot less of them that you wind up needing. This modular approach is very easy to scale up if you want to have more inputs, or you can scale it down as much as you want. This was the design that I chose, and I used them in every single one of the ships. Next, let's talk about the differences of how, at different quality levels, what the ships are going to kind of look like. So this was the design that I came up with, which I've called the Heisenberg. This particular ship is producing a whopping, I think, 1,920 science per minute, or science per second, rather, of the actual space science packs. And we can see that up here, producing 115,400 per minute. The way that this one works, and one of the really nice things about using specifically Q1, is that you can use foundries. So we actually benefit from, and sorry for all the space science going away, I'll look up here. We benefit from the fact that we can wind up using foundries to go and input directly into 4 different science assembly machines, and we can use direct insertion. I fiddled with this layout a lot, but then ultimately I got inspiration from the Q1 science that we wound up designing, so this came back from the competition. So you can wind up seeing that this is very similar to the red science design, because like it's the inputs are the same, we just can't go and produce the other one. It's a 3 input instead of a 2, but the other ones are just belted in instead of having copper. So we wind up having then just a belt here that inputs them. So it's a 10 beacon design. 10 beacon is really useful because it gets you over a 40 science per second breakpoint. And that's super convenient because if we have about 6 of these machines, right, we can produce 240 science per second. So that means that we need a total of 12, and then on per lane here, so you can see 12, 24, 48 total to produce the 1,920 that we need. Also, the nice thing is, because we're in space, you don't need power poles, so you can tightly bring all this stuff all as close as possible together, and you don't have any issues at all here in space. So, the benefit of Q1 is that the amount of asteroids you need is so incredibly small. You can see this ship is just sitting here hovering over Novice for a very long period of time. We can run this at 64x speed. You'll see that it'll do 1 trip, and then comes back to Novice and sits here forever, just constantly just producing science. You really only need very, very small travel time just due to the absurd amounts of like that you wind up getting along the trip. Along the trip is really a very small amount of in other words, what I'm saying is significantly over the amount that you're going to need. So you can see each of this is the thruster fuel level. This period is the downtime where it's not traveling. So you can see that for 20% of the time, if that even, it's actually traveling. The rest is just sitting stationary over Novice, because you're gaining even more productivity than you would with any other of the quality sciences, because you can use foundries to get an additional at least 50% productivity, but you're actually getting 150% productivity. So what's actually interesting is at the Q1 level, you're actually reprocessing a lot of the metallic asteroid chunks, because you wind up getting a lot less of the other ones along the journey. So or rather, you're consuming a lot less of those. Everything else stays exactly the same in terms of the ratios of what they're going to wind up needing, but at Q1 you wind up seeing that, like, because of the much higher productivity, you really don't need as many of the metallic asteroid chunks, so you wind up kind of evening out of what you're actually reprocessing. So that's where just there is like always a backup of metallic asteroid chunks when you're at Q1, which is not the case at higher qualities. So this is kind of what one of these designs would look like. You can see just the sheer scale of how big this ship is in order to actually go and create Q1 science. So let's go and compare and contrast that with the most extreme version, which is a Q5 ship. So let's go look at a legendary one. So I'll go and jump right away to the version that we wound up creating here. So this was the final design that we came up with. We came up with a lot of iterations to get to this particular design approach, but ultimately this is the version that we landed on. So you can see this design in action, the one that I was showing a second ago, that modular design. So this all feeds in. Now it's coming from the actual asteroid collectors, and then feeds into this particular bank, which then goes into the next one, which is then designed slightly more compact because we can have the same width, but half the number of buildings because we're going to Q2. And then we step it down to Q3, and then ultimately to Q4, and then finally have all the items feed in here where the legendary components are going to be coming into. Now, one of the things that you see right away is how much smaller this ship winds up being to produce exactly the same amount of science. And that's because purely we don't need anywhere near the amount of production, and these buildings are so incredibly small, so it's very easy to make a very compact design. So if we compare this here and look at the Q1 version, the Heisenberg, you can wind up seeing just how much smaller this ship winds up actually being compared to the Q1 version. So this one's 1,435 tons, and we go and look at this one, that's 1,285. They're still similar in terms of the size. The difference is you could need it to be wider than it is actually tall, because you're going to need to collect so many more from the collectors up here in the front. So that's a big design difference that exists as you go up in quality. You're going to notice here on this Q5 design that there's kind of this interesting thing going on. Why are we creating epic ice? There's like, why are we throwing that away? So there's a reason for that. You wind up actually getting more ice by using the oxide asteroid crushing recipe. You'll see that occasionally we're getting some legendary ice out of this. Now, the recipe is going to give you a 20% chance of getting oxide asteroid chunks back, right? So for each one that you're using. But because of the productivity that you wind up having here, right, that actually increases the chances that you have per individual time you're putting something in. You can see this progress bar each time is giving you a chance to get that oxide asteroid chunk back. You don't get that with the regular reprocessing recipe. So what that actually means is that because you're running this now for every one, you have a 300% productivity chance. You actually have 4 times you get that chance of getting something back. So that means you have effectively a 80% chance of getting the same asteroid back. That's actually a lot better than the traditional recipe, which only has a 40% chance of getting that same chunk back. Why is that important? Well, because, like we've talked about, that particular travel between Novice and Fulgora, you're not going to get a lot of ice. So this gives you a much higher chance of getting that oxide asteroid chunk back that you really want at that higher quality level. And it gives you the benefit of getting occasionally some additional ice in legendary form. And so you can see here, this is going to come through, and we're getting occasionally some additional ice, which means that we even more reduce the amount of ice that we're actually going to be consuming and feeding the blade here. So what you're seeing here too, there's just a priority. We're using this belt that comes as an input. It's going to, in the beginning, prioritize feeding these items in, and then they'll come up here and do that. Special thanks to you who actually wound up implementing this. We went through several iterations, and I'll jump into the results of why we wound up going through those iterations here in a second. But we went through a lot of iterations just to make Legendary better. So one of the things that we wound up doing was, as we continued to go through that, was we wanted that reprocessing for ice. You can see here I was using it originally in the very first design when I did the initial concept. We wound up having oxide asteroid reprocessing. Then, as it went on, there was a Mark II version, which is where you implemented this new module. And the real benefit that came from this is now we have water that can come all the way around here, and that means we have extra water that we wind up bringing into the ship. That means that we don't actually need any kind of collection of ice chunks, because we're just going to constantly be able to bring in actually what you're seeing here is 100% of the water is getting supplied by epic ice. So epic water, in other words. Now, there is some water production up here, and the only reason this exists is because we do need calcite occasionally. So this calcite gets reprocessed up here, which is just a simple little module. That goes and gets processed, comes down into this little area, and then brings the calcite in to where we need it. So now, you do wind up having too much water because of this. So what we do is we void the water, and you'll see that most exemplified over here. We have occasionally, this is going to be a recipe here that is going to be setting, in this case, the refined concrete recipe. And this will very quickly go and remove the actual water. So we can see that here, if we go and speed this up a little bit and get a little bit too much water in here, you'll see that occasionally this has to go and remove it like this. This just uses fluid voiding, goes and removes those items, and just gets rid of it. The easiest way, most UPS efficient way of just voiding fluids. So that removes then the water, and then, so whenever we back it up, that's all we wind up doing. Now, that gives you a lot more ice, which is a really nice thing. And then that means that ultimately, the two ingredients that you're going to get the most, and because of just the productivity stack that you're going to have here, you're going to wind up just always kind of low on the carbonic asteroid crushing. So you'll still occasionally need to upcycle some of those individual items. And so this is where I want to actually just really thank Klux, because Klux wound up getting completely rid of sushi, which is actually a really nice touch here for this particular design. You can see here, even up until the Mark 2.8, and we won't talk about Mark 3 because that was a failed design. So Mark 2.8 was still using sushi here with a reprocessing recipe. So there's like, I want to thank, you and Klux for both their contributions into making this better. They both have YouTube channels, so I will link them down in the video description below. We went through a very long iteration process on my Discord to try to get this all working and being in a good state. So, the next thing that I want to talk about is Asteroid, the Asteroid Collector clocking. So to demonstrate why clocking asteroid collectors is good, let's go and I'm going to turn on F5 here, and you're going to see some extra little debug stuff that's showing on. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in asteroid, and you're going to see the show asteroid collector tracking. Not that one, sorry. The asteroid arm targets. That will show this little vector of what they're trying to target. Right now you're seeing that they're locked stationary. I'm going to flip this little switch, which allows it to bypass the clocking. And what you're going to notice here as I go and start moving it is these are constantly updating as chunks are coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and start moving the ship. You're seeing just like almost every other tick or so, all the time, this is constantly going and checking what should I go and pick up, right? So this is designed for any individual ship that is traveling all over the place, right? So because of that reason, you want to be constantly going and picking things up as much as you possibly can. And so these are constantly active, trying to go and grab and scan all the different areas. Now, if I go and turn this off, you're going to notice that this is very infrequently updating. But we're still collecting almost all of the chunks that are coming in. We do occasionally drop one or miss one as they come in. But for the most part, and this is of course because they just shut down because we got to Novice, that's also very intentional, you wind up noticing that these are turned off. But let's go ahead and let this go and run for a little bit, and let's go and let it go on its journey again. You see occasionally this rests. You're seeing now we are still picking up a lot of those chunks here, not having an issue, but we're scanning for those chunks a lot less often. And that happens because we wind up having here a clock. So let me show the simple example here of an asteroid clock that exists. Ben, I actually introduced it. All this does is it just wraps around for every 22 ticks, so it's always 1 minus if you're using a decider combinator for this. Every 22 ticks, we're going to wrap around the clock here, and then we're going to emit a little check mark. That check mark comes to each of these asteroid collectors, and then they're going to go and enable and disable every single time that we wind up going and saying, hey, go and check for new chunks, right? So by disabling and enabling it rapidly like that, you can wind up having that new behavior where these individual things are updating, or those lines are updating a lot less often. So that means that the collectors aren't constantly scanning. And that can really reduce the entity update time of those individual asteroid collectors. So now, a thing that I wound up experimenting with as we got further and further in the design iteration was I said, well, because we know you're going to get more chunks at the end than you are in the beginning, you're going to kind of want to clock them faster in this section here and back, and you want them kind of clocked a little bit slower over here. So the way that I handled that was I wound up going and checking every single time we're traveling between here and Novice. So whenever we're going away from Novice, we wind up inputting the current signal of the velocity signal here. So depending on the direction, so if we're going towards Novice, then that is going to be a positive number. And if it is away from Novice, we just subtract 3 from that to make it -1 to make the velocity go the other direction. That means that we can go and create a very simple distance tracker. So we'll go and move this over here. So you can see here, if I pause the game, we are now currently at a value of 5.4 thousand, which is the current distance away from Novice. I have it reset because you may not launch from the actual planet, so because of that, I always wanted this clock to always reset whenever we got to Novice, just to make sure that we are starting from 0 whenever we would launch from Novice. Because you might build on Vulcanus, you might build on other planets, and this clock would get screwed up. So this effectively then is just taking, that velocity is, distance over time. And well, we know what the time is. There's 60 ticks per second. So if we just take the sum of the velocity and divide it by 60, then you're going to wind up knowing what distance you've traveled. That's all you really have to do. So that distance and also the planets get fed into this much more complicated scheduler. But it basically now allows us to say, hey, what distance are we away from Novice on the trip? So right now we're less than 10,000 kilometers away. We're going to have a much slower clock because there's a lot less asteroids to pick up. And you can see that here. There's not a very high density of asteroids that we're going to need to pick up during this journey. So then once we wind up, and we'll go and move this a little bit forward until we get to the point where the asteroids you see here, now we're getting a lot more dense here at 10,000 kilometers. This is when I want to kick it a little more into high gear, and I want to run it every 22 ticks so that we update a little bit more often the clock and wind up going and trying to grab things. Now, I haven't perfectly gotten it so that it picks up everything. And through testing, I found that it actually was worse to pick up everything. Now, that might not apply for things like Promethium, but like for space science, I couldn't, like, the more aggressively I clocked the asteroid collectors, sure, we pick up more items and then we would rest longer over Novice, but it wound up just being better to not pick up every single chunk and rather just wind up having just the amount that we wind up needing and a little bit of a surplus on top of that. So that's the schedule that I wound up creating here for this, and I copied this on multiple different ships. You wind up seeing here as we now come back from Novice, you're seeing here that we're going to Novice, and we're continuing to have that higher tick rate, constantly pulsating, until we wind up getting below the 4,000 kilometer mark. So now we're 7,000 away, we're now 6,000, getting closer and closer to Novice. This is distance away from Novice the whole time. And then the moment that we get into a less dense zone, like this, we step it back down to the much slower clock. So that was a dynamic approach, which wound up actually being better. Not a huge amount better, but definitely better for UPS to do it this way. More complicated, yes, but it requires you to really watch your ship as it goes back and forth and exactly look at how, like, the items that it's picking up. But mainly, as long as you're getting the throughput that you want, you can keep kind of stepping down your clock. It's just a balancing act, because you eventually will get to a point where you have too many asteroids down here on this belt. And very simply, the way that when that happens, you don't want to collect more. So you want the ship ultimately to stop when you have a large backup like you're seeing here. When this gets completely full, you want the ship to get in a spot where it says, hey, in this case, I have enough science, and this is currently less, then I want to have a low battery signal. So if the sum of all legendary asteroids that are here, which is, let me take 10 plus 6 plus 4, that's going to be 20 legendary that we're going to get out of this. If we have less than 10 of those, that means that we've reached a backup state. We want to stop over Novice. So here you can see that there's no low battery, and it just waits here over Novice until that low battery happens again. So that takes a little while, and it might take like 2 minutes while this is just sitting here, because we do collect a lot more asteroids than we wind up needing, because the ship is definitely designed a little bit over the scale that you'd wind up needing for 320 per second. So you can see here this all backs up. We continue to empty all the buffers of all the other science, and then eventually, once we consume this, you can see here that we have now dropped below the condition, or almost, so we'll wait here a little bit longer. The moment that this drops below, we'll wait here. Wait here a while. Alright, there we go. It all of a sudden dropped below that value. That means that this is completely empty. And then at this point now we can go and take off again, because we need to collect more. So the key here is just making sure you have enough of a buffer here on this particular belt, so that you don't wind up running out of it as you go and are continuously producing over Novice the science that you have. The last thing that I want to talk about is specifically the collectors. The reason I'm doing direct insertion here is actually a throughput thing. I want to have less items on this belt, but I want them to be higher quality. So that means that occasionally this is going to back up a little bit. So when it backs up, that's when we have this inserter here that will drop those items specifically onto the belt. I wind up not reprocessing ice here directly, because you wind up getting so much more, in this case, metallic asteroids, and then you get a little bit less of the carbonic asteroids, and then you get very, very infrequently any ice. So there's no filters that are set on here, so this is the ratio that I came up with still directly inserting. But because this is going to reprocess, and you have effectively a total of like an 80-ish% chance of getting something back, you're going to wind up reducing. The math isn't exactly right. I don't remember exactly the amount that you wind up getting, but either way, you're losing some. And that's intentional, because like you don't actually want Q1 at all. You want Q5. So this reduces the amount of inputs, and thus also reduces the amount of reprocessing you need here directly off of a belt. So this effectively acts as a compressor to reduce the amount of items that come into the belt so that you have less that you need to reprocess, thus downstream of it. That was a design philosophy that I did here, and I applied it through all the other individual designs. So let's step down in quality to just show the differences in what you're going to need at each of these. So you'll see that the asteroid collectors start actually getting reduced in the number of asteroid collectors you wind up needing as the actual science block starts to increase in size, right? So now we have more because we're running Epic here. So this is the Skylar Mark 1, where you can wind up seeing that we have a very similar design philosophy. I wind up having the same kind of reprocessing setup down here. I wind up having the exact same modules that are here, but then just removing each individual step because we only need rare now, right? And then if we step it down, I'll show the smaller Jesse Mark II. This was the same design. Now we have less collectors because we don't need as many. We don't need the 6. We just need the 4. That's plenty. And then this ship now, except it's not going to need now as much reprocessing. So you can see this modular design getting shrunk down. But now we need more buildings to produce the actual ice, and also thus more actual assembly machines to go and create the actual raw science. Now, for Blue Science, we have 2 different ships that I really want to talk about. I've got Jesse Mark II, and I've also got the Fring Mark II, which is twice the scale, just to do a test of are bigger ships better. I'm very proud of this particular ship because it is very space efficient for the exact size that it is. Still is using fluid voiding down here that you saw with Legendary, but you need a lot more fluid voiding because you're producing an absolute gargantuan amount of actual ice from this. Of water. So you're making 255,000 water per minute, and you need to get rid of it because you need nowhere near that amount of fluid here. You need 15,000 per minute. So you have a surplus of 235,000 water that you need to get rid of somehow. So that's where we need now 3 of these that are constantly flickering on and off and removing all of that. So this is where you can see here then too, this is leveraging the fact that we need a lot less collectors here on the front, but still using that same design of going and compressing the amount of inputs so that we need less for the actual blocks here, right? So let's step it down to uncommon. You can wind up seeing again, we wind up now having even more assembly machines, but way less processing. So this is the smallest amount that you're going to need. So the tiniest little module that you're going to wind up needing for reprocessing the chunks. So there was a design choice that I made initially early on to wind up going and stopping the inputs here. I've eventually realized I don't need to do that. I can just go and stop the inputs for the asteroid collectors once we get to Novice. But I wound up not revisiting for Q2, and you'll see why once we get to the results. So, and that's a little bit of a spoiler, so sorry about that. So, winds up then kind of going and saying hey, you need less reprocessing, of course, up here, but now a lot more production for that particular raw inputs, and then ultimately coming down into the hub. The last thing that I wanted to experiment with is, and the question that kind of arises is, all right, you have all these, you're producing different amounts of those sciences at different qualities. So that means that when it comes to the bot traffic at the hub, specifically here, if we go look at this, right? We come down here to the hub, you can see that this is the equivalent amount of legendary science you're going to need compared to the way more amount that you're going to need for quality 1. And there's varying amounts of that science that you're going to need at each of those quality levels. So then that translates, of course, to labs. So I have a set of save files that I'm going to demonstrate where I wind up actually creating here a lab simulator. What this is these are, you're going to have effectively, just for simplicity's sake, you're going to have 32 inserters for a bank of labs. So what this is doing is it's modeling at 160 per second per side, 240 per second, 100 or 640 per 640 here, and then over here this is going to be more and more. Anyway, you get the idea. The point is that each of the different quality levels, you're going to need more and more inserters, and they're going to have to swing more often. So I have clocked all these inserters here to simulate the input that the labs would wind up actually having on Novice, to kind of get an idea of how expensive would these inserters be if we take that into account as well. So let me show and walk you through some of those save files. So here's a Q1 version. We're making 460,000 per minute that we are creating of space science. And you can see that here, I have gone and created 4 of those ships. Each of the save files always have 4, and some of them have the labs and some of them don't. So I can test both in isolation. You wind up seeing here that these are all the raw sea of actual space science. You need 32 lanes. And so for comparison, that is twice the scale of my current base. So I've just done this so that for future, if we wanted to scale up, that's kind of like an indicator of what that would look like, but it also creates more of a load on the network. So you can see here that we're going to need almost 3,000 bots constantly running to keep up with the demand here for all this science that is very, very difficult to even see what's happening. But you're going to need a lot more bots to deliver all of this science here. So here's our huge bank of simulated labs, so we can wind up seeing that. Now, next, let's go and we'll talk through Q5, which is a very different one. So at the extreme, let's go all the way up to Q5 that exists. So if we come here and we look at this, oh wow, we need a lot less bots for this. We need like maybe 200, 300 bots to do this. So you can wind up seeing here that this is constantly getting fed and going to all of these labs. Now, you'll notice there's some gaps in here. That's intentional. Each inserter can produce 80 per second. 80 per second times 2 is 160, and 160 times a total of 6 is 960 per second, which, if you divide that by 240, is going to be 4 belts worth of science. So you can feed 2 in for every 8 total of that you would for normal quality science. So that's why I've just very simply had 2 inserters per lane that's just getting routed to the actual labs. And if your labs are actually clocked, you can just use 2 inserters, and that's all you end up needing. So this is kind of like the sheer difference in scale of to one extreme of Q5 going all the way down to Q1 in terms of how much traffic and throughput you're going to have at the hub, right? And just to be able to go and deliver those items. The big strong side of Q5 is this setup. The downside of Q5 is the amount of raw asteroids you're going to have to collect. So compared to the Q1 ship that we saw that barely ever has to run back and forth between the planets, you're going to see here, this one here, for like the actual travel between the planets, is going to be very often. It's much, much more frequently. So like 60 to 70% of the time it's actually traveling back and forth because it just needs to constantly collect more and more raw items. So that's the question. At all these different quality levels, and taking into account the labs, which of these sciences is going to perform the best? So I've talked through as much as I can right now. Let's just get right into the results and I'll tell you which one's the best. So before we actually ran the benchmarks, everyone on my Discord, including myself, was convinced that Q5 was going to be the winner. So when we actually got the results, as you're seeing now, our jaws hit the floor when we wound up realizing that Rare was actually better. We were, I think, suffering from copium a lot because we kept on iterating on Q5, constantly making it better. We went through 11 different versions and improvements and benchmarked all of them, just trying to squeeze out a 1 microsecond here or 2 microseconds there. I'll dive more into some of those changes because that actually helps explain all the concepts of which ones were worth it beforehand that I've talked about so far. But it winds up being that Rare actually is the best quality science that we designed. So all these designs, just to recap on that, they're all designed for 1920 per second. So each one is equivalent to that. So Q1 winds up making a 7680 science per second, and this is across 4 ships. You wind up having then the Jesse Mark II makes 2560, but they're all the same effective amount of science. This is always simulated with bots pulling things out, and in this case getting unloaded into infinity chests. So here, what's interesting, when I first did these tests, I ran them without Epic because I assumed there'd be a clear pattern. When you looked at this initially, you see Q1 is better, Q2 is a little bit worse, and then Q5 is better all of a sudden. It's like why is Q1 the worst, then Q2 is better, and then Q5 winds up being better than that, but then it switches to Q3. So the moment we introduced an Epic version, so I created this Skylar Mark I, that's where the pattern was really clear. So Q2 and Q4 are equal. They are almost exactly equal. They are 0.18% difference between the two. Now, again, the ships could be optimized, right? And there's things that we can do as we learn from Q5, but the point was that the initial ships with the exact same methodology for how they were designed, they wound up being almost exactly equal. So the pattern really is that Q1 has way too much science production and too much bot activity on Novice. Q4 and Q2 are equivalent in terms of balancing out the amount of production and upcycling and bot activity. And then Q5 winds up being slightly better, assuming the reduction in the bot activity at the hub. But then Q3 is the best of both worlds. You have 1/3 of the actual bot activity, 1/3 of the actual amount of inserters that you wind up needing. And then you also wind up having 1/3 of a lot less reprocessing that you wind up needing at Q3. But then, so it winds up actually kind of balancing itself out. And no matter how hard we tried to make Q5 a little bit better, Q3 still winds up winning in the end. So that's the actual answer. Which science is going to be the best? It's going to be Q3. Now, we'd explored in the past, is Q1 or Q5 better? So that still proves to be true. Q5 is better than Q1 by a significant margin, right? But Q3 just slightly starts to outperform Q5. So let me go through now just all those 11 designs that we talked about for Q5. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to touch on a couple highlights to talk about which methods actually wound up being better for the ship that you're seeing now behind me, which is the Ultimate Mark IV, which is the final iteration of Q5. So here's the account of all of those changes. I lied, there was actually 12 total designs, not just 11. So what you're seeing on the bottom is the Forester. That's the very first video design that I wound up showcasing in the original beginning of the video. That's the current version that's in my mega base, and I use that kind of as a baseline for Q5. So you see that the first version of Walt winds up being better than, having two of those ships winds up being better than the original Forester. So that's so I've already, through some of the different designs, and my original approach was better than what I was doing before. So that's a good thing. Now, what was interesting is when you see Mark 2.2, the changes that came from that was you wound up going and using Q4 water production, increase the yield of Q5 ice asteroids, and that made the largest difference here. There's some minor things that then Klux wound up adding, so reducing a lot of clocking the fluid producers on the right hand side, switching it to voiding via concrete because that was a little bit better than just voiding via barrel recipe. There was also less full belt reeds that wound up getting added, and then also clocking the iron outserters from the furnaces. So those changes going from Walt Mark 1 to Mark 2.2 wound up making an improvement where the old version was about 5% worse. Then when we go and get to the next part that wound up being a little bit more interesting, we get to Mark 2.3. That's where we introduced asteroid collector clocking. So you can wind up seeing that 2.3 is way up above 2.2. So if we look at that, we wind up seeing that 2.2 versus 2.3, and we'll ignore the ones that are in between because those were failed iterations, but you wind up seeing that 2.3 winds up being at about 208 microseconds versus 2.2 winds up being 216 microseconds. That's 8 microsecond delta. So that's a significant amount that came just from asteroid clocking alone. So that's clearly worth it when it comes to that. So then when we get to the next version that's a little bit better than 2.3, which is 2.7, which I'm going to talk about, that's where we wound up fixing a mistake that I wound up making, which is where I forgot to actually clock the fusion inserters that go into the fusion plants. And that's actually where you see that actually wound up being worth it as well, was doing that specifically, because that's where we got, we reduced it by another 4 microseconds here. I appreciate the fact that everything I'm talking about now is in 2 or 3 microseconds, and yes, that's how hard we were trying to make Q5 better. But still, you can extrapolate this to Prometheum, and it'll be very similar patterns that you wind up seeing there, and that's where the benefits are going to be much, much higher. Finally, in the version 2.8 and Mark IV, those were almost exactly equivalent, 1 microsecond delta. Mark IV is the one that I wound up actually choosing, and the reason I wind up choosing it is because they didn't use sushi belts at all, and Cluck spent a lot of time, I think about 6 hours, trying to get that into a good spot. So I wanted to appreciate that and utilize that design. So in 2.8, what I wound up fixing was a bug that I introduced where we would accidentally reprocess constantly carbonic unnecessarily. You should never be reprocessing carbonic because you're always going to be running low on it. It was a bug that I had in the circuit logic. So that made the final improvement. Now that same fix was created, forked in parallel by Klux, and ultimately that wound up getting into Mark IV. So that was ultimately just making sure that we are only reprocessing ice and the metallic asteroids because that's what we're going to have in excess. So in summary, the things that are worth it, asteroid clocking, without a doubt, going and using the normal recipe for ice production, using epic water to produce the actual, like getting extra ice is also worth it. And then ultimately going and clocking the fusion inserters is also something that is worth it. And you can check it out yourself. There's going to be blueprints in the video description below, but you can see how that's actually being clocked in both the Walt design and now in the final version, which is the Fring. And we'll talk about that design here last. The last thing that I want to talk about is, are bigger ships better or smaller ships but more ships? So which one's actually going to wind up winning out? So the ship that you see behind here is twice the scale of Jessie, and we've called this one the Fring. So you can see the original Jessie Mark II, which wound up being the best ship that we wound up designing. Now, Akara, a few months ago on my Discord, wound up creating also a Q3 variant, but had made it at twice the scale. So just running a benchmark just on that quick design that was prototyped already proved to be better. So that wound up leading me to going and designing the Fring from scratch, which uses all the concepts we learned from Q5 and all those designs that we learned from those improvements that I was just talking about, and applied those to the Fring. So that what made it slightly better and improved on that design. And that's that final design that you saw behind originally when we first transitioned here. So the Fring winds up using all the best of both worlds, uses uncommon ice. It winds up going and using an asteroid collecting, the dynamic schedule that we wind up having, and then ultimately wind up making the ship a little bit more compact and using less asteroid collectors. So that was the design choices that went into that final design that came in. So it's very clear here that the pattern is Jessie Mark II makes there was 4 ships that were needed for the benchmark, whereas the Fring and Akara, those different versions, had only 2 ships that were required. And you can see that there is a very clear UPS improvement that comes by about, it was 10% worse to run 2 ships rather than just running one larger big ship, right? So you wind up seeing that that's the case from the best version that we had. So that's the answer on should you run more ships or one large ship. Is you should go and you should build a ship for the scale of the base that you're currently running when you're designing for the mega base situation. So with that, let's go and ship this thing into production. All right, back in the actual save file, we have actually launched the Fring Mark 2.2. All right, you didn't see this in the benchmark results. There's tiny, small differences that I made as I was running this with research productivity turned on. I started to notice some problems. One of them was like really sporadic production because this was clocked for twice the speed. I needed a way to shut this down before we got to the point of just constantly, anytime that science wound up going and getting ejected like this, would kick the clocks back on because we dropped below the limit that we had set, which we wanted 230,000 space science packs in here. So what it would wind up doing was just like, okay, we're 230,000. All right, we dropped 1,000. All right, run for a couple seconds and then stop. That constant starting and stopping was really aggressive on the assembly machines, and they couldn't even benefit from the actual full clock cycle. So what I just changed, and this will be in the blueprint book, and you can get this the latest version. I didn't feel like going and re-benchmarking them because it's such a small difference, and you wouldn't even see it in the actual benchmark save files because they're running at full speed. But what I wound up just doing very simply is I just said, like, hey, anytime we drop below 153,000, go and emit a science pack signal and keep on running science until we get to the total amount that we want, which is 230,400. That number is specifically chosen because that's the amount that we can actually produce on a trip there and back. And so the idea is that if you are constant or just slightly over that, so if you're constantly running space science, you'll constantly stay in this latch state. So if you're at full consumption rate. But then when you go under that, right now what we're running here for, research prod, it's half the rate. We just cycle back and forth between the low condition, which is less 153,000, and we wait here, you'll continue to notice this. We'll just wait here for load because we do consume this relatively quickly. So right now, the difference that would happen before is this would constantly be producing right now, but I don't want it to produce because I'd rather it produce for a large period of time so that we can benefit from the clock that we have on the actual assembly machine, so that it's very smooth production and then a full stop. So just latching the science output. You can see there it goes and gets kicked off. Now we're going and producing at full speed, bringing every single thing in, and we'll keep on running until we get over that amount. And you'll see that also very nicely here on the actual production graph. See these very large periods of a lot of science getting produced, and then nothing. Large amounts, and then nothing. So in this case, we're actually taking off, and we're going to get to the point where we have 100% of that science already. So even though in the trip, right now we're not going to be producing the whole time that we're going, but because we have this buffer that we need to satisfy, this constraint here that's telling us how much rare that we actually have on the belt, that is going to be the other thing we need to satisfy. So I don't really care about them being synchronized, like when we're going consuming, when we're producing. The point is just that we still have both of those conditions need to always be satisfied, and that's why in this particular case, you're seeing, okay, we're traveling, we're not producing science. That's fine. What we're doing right now is we are just waiting to make sure that we have enough of the rare actual items. You can see here now we get over novice. We have plenty of the actual rare materials that we need. We don't have enough space science, but we're not going to go and take off from novice until we drop below 150. And that just kind of is a very simple schedule to keep the ship not constantly running back and forth between the different places. So anyway, so those are some of the changes that I made since the actual benchmarks. Otherwise, there it is. Got rare science flowing through. I had to change the clocks here, which was about as hard as going here. And if I can actually see this because it's so dark, just changing this to rare. And that was all I had to do for the circuitry. The more complicated bit was draining all of the white science and then just making sure none of the inserters got stuck with holding legendary science in their hands. There's only 2 or 3 that actually had that, so that wasn't too bad. But still something that I had to kind of be aware of as I was looking at that. All the legendary science has been since eradicated. So now, yeah, we're running rare science here. That means that we could keep, because it is going from 6 down to basically like 6 science down, quality science down to 3, so 300% effectivity. We wind up then just having to double the lanes, but that was all we wound up having to do. So I could keep the exact same belt routing that I had before, but instead of having 1 belt of legendary science that I feed, now I have 2 belts of rare science that I needed to feed down here. I had some issues with this occasionally not fully stopping here because it was running just rare. So what I wound up doing is I doubled up and added 1 extra inserter just to make sure that we constantly had back pressure here of the rare science, but then otherwise removed all the other inserters. So we keep this still very compact like we had before, but we do need to now have a couple little extra outs, like just modifying this in place to account for rare. So we did need to go and increase the number of inserters overall for that. But that also makes sense. We have more throughput now down here. So that's it. So hopefully you found this as earth-shattering as I did, that legendary science over Q1, and I would have thought it was either legendary or it was going to be common science that was going to be the best. But here we are in this weird world of that this blue science is the best flavor here of what you can use while mega basing. So hopefully you appreciate it. These kind of video takes a whole bunch of effort for me to go and do all the research and all the testing. And so again, special shout out to all the people on my Discord. Thank you so much for all the help. But if you appreciate this, I would love if you don't mind liking the video. That helps out the channel a whole bunch. And if you think I've earned your subscription today, I'd love for you to hit that button. Never gonna ask for it, but just, if you appreciate what you're doing, it motivates me a lot. So thank you very much. Anyway, thank you for your attention span, for watching this as always, and I will see you in the next video.